Nothing.
I was gonna let it go.
Okay, thank you.
Hey,
practice
get that yellow book off. Yep. There we go. We don't want people to see that yet.
Welcome back to Cross Politic on the Fight Laugh Feast Network. This segment is brought to you by Cross Politic Coffee.
Oh, I was going to say the tumblers.
And the tumblers?
Yeah, that you can get if you're a Fight Laugh Feast Club member.
Nice. With
Silver.
us on the line right now, we got Mr. Jerry Bowyer.
Bowyer.
He's a financial economist, public speaker for business conferences, frequent writer for Forbes, Fox, CNBC, National Review, Wall Street Journal, frequent radio, television guest, even appearing on such shows as Cross Politic.
Woo.
He is the author of
Fire.
The Bush Boom, The Free Market Capitalist Survival Guide, and most recently, the book I'm holding in my hand, The Maker versus the Takers. He's from Pennsylvania with his wife and 3 or maybe 4 of his 7 kids. Jerry, thanks for joining us on Cross Politic.
He-ya.
Okay, you're going to be just
He's
fine
listened
here.
to the show before.
Jerry, I got to ask a question. Are your kids baptized? Did you baptize them as babies? Just wondering.
They were. I didn't baptize them as babies, but they were baptized as babies.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
that's why you're getting along
I
so
did
well.
baptize my niece. I'm a deacon, so
Okay.
I didn't baptize, so I did baptize my niece.
Okay.
That seemed okay. But it seemed like if I were baptizing my kids, it would be like, well, what am I? Am I, is this like a patriarchal priest thing, or do we have a separation between those roles?
I
That's
just want to
good. That's good.
I wanted to be a good reformed person and say that's a different thing. That's a different hierarchy.
We agree.
Separation of powers, jurisdictions, all that.
I think kind of
Jerry,
an important follow-up question here in all this. How many votes were counted in Allegheny? Was there some voter fraud in Allegheny?
Well, there's always some voter fraud. But the question is there enough voter fraud to overturn the election? I've squeezed the math pretty hard here. By the way, for the record, I believe that in Pennsylvania, the law was violated in that the governor extended a deadline
Without legislative
in contravention of the legislature.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is a highly politicized Supreme Court, and they upheld that. And I think that if someone with standing, I don't think Texas had standing, but I think if someone with standing took that to the Supreme Court, we'd win. But my analysis of the math is it wouldn't reverse the results.
Gotcha. So, Maker versus the Takers. Thank you for writing this book. It was really helpful. I want to know, why does Jesus never confront anyone about wealth in Galilee?
Well, but my thesis is that the reason for that is because we know from the archaeological remains, and we also know from contemporary historical sources that Galilee was a very different economy from Judea, that Galilee was more entrepreneurial, less state-centered, lower tax, more dynamic. I remember reading one particular archaeological report where one of the archaeologists said, pretty much every time we dig up a village in Galilee, we find 3 or 4 shops. So it was like a shopkeeper society, whereas Judea was a cronyist society. Whether you want to talk about, we have modern labels, crony capitalism in the West, nomenclatura, deep state, which is a term associated historically with Turkey that's kind of been picked up in the American context. Ruling class, establishment, there are different names, but there tend to be these groups clustered around political power that are both public and private, in which the private wealth is dependent on association with political power. And I think that Jesus is only denouncing or confronting wealthy people in the Judean context because he disapproves of extraction of wealth using manipulation, but he doesn't disapprove of the creation of wealth like the thing he grew up with in Galilee.
So you're saying Jesus was a proto-socialist?
Well, if I'm saying anything that contemporary, I'm saying more like the opposite.
Right.
You do have to build a hermeneutical bridge. So I don't want to be too quick to just grab it and bring it into our own time.
Sure.
But what I would say is that somebody who wants to give us a big state Jesus has to overcome a lot of objections, because the actual historical Jesus was only confronting wealthy people who were associated with the state. He has no confrontations with any wealthy individuals who were not closely associated with the state. Yeah. Now, if you want to say, well, Jesus was right then, but now it's different, now the state can be used for good. I want to say, okay, just tell me what it is about human nature that's changed between Second Temple Judaism and now. And I'm open to your idea that this time the state can be our friend, but you're swimming against the tide when it comes to Jesus's rhetoric, when you're shaming market wealth and excusing political power and, for that matter, religious power.
One of the things you're doing in your book, Jerry, is bringing out all kinds of historical and geographical and economic details from the text that really is rarely done.
Yeah, Bible dictionaries, encyclopedias, I've read them.
I mean,
this thing is packed.
Why isn't more of this kind of work being done on the text?
I suppose I would suggest a couple of reasons. One, because it's really hard work. Writing this book was a major pain in the neck. And I mean, it was joyful, but it was also just a lot of just hours.
Tedious.
The thing that drove me is I really wanted to know what Jesus thought.
Yeah.
When I did this, I did several years of research on this book. In some ways, I've done 30 years of research. I didn't plan a book. I didn't want a book. I was talked into the book later by a publisher. I'm glad I did it. But I really wanted to know. So you put in the work. I think that's one thing. I think another thing is I've noticed something among many pastors and Christian thought leaders, which is there's this phrase, that'll preach.
Yeah.
I've heard it in the green room in Christian TV, like you do an idea and someone says, "Oh, that'll preach."
Yeah.
And I think we stop at that'll preach and then we preach it. Whereas what you really have to ask is not will it preach, but is it true?
Preach, preacher.
And I think in many cases we bring forth sermons. Our sermons are prematurely birthed. As soon as there's something that'll work Sunday morning, we're done.
Yeah.
The fact is that I'm not a week-to-week clergyman.
Right,
I'm like I drop in once a quarter to guest preach. So I can wait until I have a conclusion.
Right.
But the pressure is on. So I'm not going to go after pastors as much. Christian thought leaders, there has to be a new book every year.
Yeah.
There has to be Benedict option. Okay, what's the next one? They just have to keep it rolling. And I think that you just can't reconcile that with a lot of time spent with the original sources and Bible dictionaries and reading Josephus and Philo and Tacitus.
Yeah. So, Jerry, I can kind of play in the devil's advocate a little bit here. So what? So what? Jesus focused some of his rebukes on Jerusalem, most of his economic rebukes on Jerusalem. Didn't
all
really,
of them.
All of them on Jerusalem and not on Galilee. So what? What does that have to do with me and my Bible and our economic situation here in America?
It has an enormous amount to do with you because the experience that I've had, I move in the world of Christian entrepreneurs, and most of them feel like they are guilty until proven innocent in religious culture of being marketplace people. And I think that what the message is coming out of the Gospels is that anybody can be greedy and anyone can be a money idolater, but that danger is probably greater among people who are politically connected and part of the ruling class in the hierarchy than it is the marketplace person. So instead of hey, I'm a pastor, or more now, I'm a politician. You didn't build that. Give it to me.
Yep.
And instead of saying, well, that person probably isn't greedy because they're talking about redistributing, I think the default coming out of Jesus is those are the people who have to prove they're not greedy, the people who got their wealth and power through political manipulation. So I'm saying that priests and senators, they can be saved too. But it's hard. But it's harder for them to get into the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through an eye of a needle. But even they can be saved.
So
as opposed to, I think, what most entrepreneurs in the pew or most citizens get is, well, you can be saved even though you're a marketplace person.
Yeah. Right. That's right. So you just connected the dots for me. I think you wrote this book for our friend David Bonson, who's feeling pretty guilty. Is that?
I don't know.
Did he commission you to write this book? Did he pay for you to write this book?
If you follow David Bonson, him and guilt aren't running together at all as friends. So Jerry, I want to, it's funny because I was reading the book and I was thinking to myself, I kind of got mad at you, to be honest, because I'm looking and reading the book. I'm like, this book is about few years too late. When we were going through the Obama, when he was coming into his height and running for presidency, we could have really used this book then, because I watch Christians get beat over the back with what Jesus said. And it's funny because they will preach exegetical sermons, but they won't go and talk through the economics of, the Gospels like you did in this book. And so I just want to say I was upset at you reading this book. Man, you're too late on this. I know you had to work hard on it, but you could have had this a little earlier. Could you, something that's really on, I want to go through a few of your chapters. One of the things you're doing here is you kind of mess with my head as you talk about, here's one of the chapters, Economic Philosophy of the Virgin Mary. Can you walk through that? Because people don't talk like that. I don't think I've ever heard that term before. The
Economic Philosophy of the Virgin Mary.
I mean, are you Catholic? What's up?
Yeah, that's interesting because that does go on, but also I get pushback from Catholics too.
Yeah, I bet.
Because I'm treating her as a historical figure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm treating her as a real, live, human person. And the problem is we have all these ongoing grudge matches that there are aspects of medieval Catholicism that more or less turn her into a goddess.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's a Protestant reaction, which is don't talk about her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We don't know what to do with her.
Yeah, we don't know what to do with her. So the original pushback I got was from some Catholic friends, that this is historicism. Well, is she a real person, or was she a hologram? Is she a ghost?
Yeah.
She's a real person, and she had real opinions. The Eusebius said she grew up in Sepphoris, which would have meant she would have been around a lot of financial activity and around like some high culture. Yeah. So she was intelligent. It appears to me she's intelligent. She wrote a great poem in the Magnificat, and she clearly had political and economic opinions. But it's interesting. I mean, you had a shock reaction to that. Hugh Hewitt, who's Catholic, said when he read that, he felt like it was an electric shock going through him. Because he grew up in a Catholic school. Well, he's Catholic, right. So he grew up in the world of Marian devotion.
Yeah.
Right? So she can't be political and economic because she's religious, and religion's above all that. Huh. And I just got pushed back. Doug Wilson did a blog about this, and someone down below, a scholar, unnamed scholar, pushed back on the Mary stuff. He said, well, she's just quoting Hannah. Well, why is she quoting Hannah?
Yeah.
Right.
She's quoting Hannah because she thought that Hannah was relevant to that moment.
Yeah.
And Hannah was talking about this was a time of great corruption, Hannah's time of great corruption in Israel, centering in the temple and in the ruling class. So Mary could have channeled Miriam's great song, which was about the enemies of Israel, but instead Mary taps into the enemies within Israel, the ruling class as enemies of Yahweh and of his people.
Yeah. So put a little more meat on that. What was Mary's idea of economics?
Her idea of economics was that the ruling class of her time needed to be deposed, that those who were full, those who were proud in their hearts and who were economically full needed to be deposed from their thronos, from their thronoi, that's thronu maybe, genitive.
I was going to correct you on that.
Sorry, I'm winging it. They had to be deposed from their thronon. So she is saying there needed to be a social change. And it's interesting, she says this in the presence of Elizabeth in Judea. Mm-hmm. Mary goes from Nazareth down to Judea, and then she meets with her sister. She meets with Elizabeth. With a relative, it'd be broader on that. She meets with a relative who is, in some sense, a member of the Judean ruling class because her husband was part of the ceremony of offering incense.
Right.
And she's received by Elizabeth, which is a social reversal. She's saying, Elizabeth is saying, you came to me? Mm-hmm. The mother of my Lord should come to me? So there's an economic and political and status reversal here. And in response to that, Mary sings a song about economic and political and social status reversal. I'm sorry, that's not a coincidence.
So distinguish all of that, though, so we have the social justice world. So distinguish what you're talking about from sort of intersectionality. I'm a minority, so you have to receive me. We need to reverse. We need to empower the powerless. I mean, because a lot of that kind of language is frequently used. Somebody will appeal to the Magnificat and then say, "See, that's why I believe in social justice." What are you talking about? Are you defending social justice there?
Well, no. But I ran into this very early on. By talking about a Jesus with a social justice message, there's a kind of a right-wing reactionary response to that.
Right.
Like they own social justice. No, they stole social justice.
Okay.
Social justice comes from mid-19th century conservative Catholicism. Social justice doctrine was formulated in resistance to socialism.
Okay.
And then later on gets tied up with the abortion issue. That individual justice is, I won't go out and get an abortion. Social justice is, we will not legally permit abortions. So there's an individual and there's a social development to justice. But like what happens so often, this becomes a shibboleth and the left steals something of ours.
Right.
And we don't know enough to know that it was ours to begin with. So then we get mad at anybody who says it.
Right.
And I'm not willing to surrender any more ground. I want to take back ground. They have to tell me why they can use the phrase social justice, given that they do not have an objective concept of justice, given that they have an atomistic social philosophy, and how in the world they can bring this to a Bible, which is entirely, they're like stealing from the Bible. What Augustine says is, we're going to steal from the Egyptians. The Egyptians are stealing back from us, and we're saying, okay, Egyptians, have it. We won't do that we won't talk about social justice anymore. That's yours. So, I think that's the wrong response.
So zero in. Appreciate all that. Zero in, though, particularly on the economics of Mary and this role reversal stuff that you're talking about. How is that not sort of to use your how is that not a
throwing your privilege out the door?
An abuse of the social justice concepts. The idea that just because you have less, you deserve more. The idea.
I see. I get what you're driving at.
Yeah.
So I just kind of set off on a rant.
No, that's great.
We like rampages.
It was a good one. It was a good one.
All right. So here's the difference. The biblical concept of social justice is objective. Mm-hmm. So sometimes those people on top will in fact belong there.
Yeah.
You can have good rulers. So sometimes the corruption is mainly at the top, and therefore you need a reversal. And sometimes the corruption is mainly at the bottom. Moses did a lot of cracking down on the grassroots. So I think what's happened is we've been brought into a Marxian view in some ways by associating a class with righteousness. But when you read, the commentary and a lot of the Reformed catechisms, on what does honor your father and mother look like, it means that proper authority should be properly obeyed. But the catechism makes a point to say that essentially there are two violations. One is oppression by those in authority, and the other is rebellion by those not in authority. So the biblical and historic Reformed view is that good and bad are not associated with a certain class. But there are moments in history, at Mary's moment in history, the corruption was centered at the top.
Yeah, that's
right?
helpful. That's helpful.
So I wrote a book a few years ago about Barack Obama, and I talked about this, and I said, I think right now the corruption is centered at the top. Right? But in my opinion, we're very much in danger of, in reaction to that, creating a situation where the grassroots are also unjust or wicked in many ways.
Yeah.
And that if we just think that populism is always good, we're going to fall into the structural concept of Marxism.
Yeah.
That you're right when you're right and you're wrong when you're wrong, whatever class you're in.
Right.
But in Second Temple Judaism, down here was generally more righteous than up here, so you needed a social reversal.
That's helpful. That's really helpful.
That's really good, and that'd be true. I guess kind of a reverse example would be what you mentioned earlier, where Moses, kind of up top, tended to be more righteous, and down below was the ones complaining and
the rabble.
Right.
Can we talk about
another example? Would be David, right? David was generally a righteous king, and he had to put down uprisings.
Yeah.
So in that case, the evil was coming from a little bit more below, from his own son or from other forces. So the good is never like low. Satan's tricky. He moves around. Sometimes he hides in the ruling class. Sometimes he hides, down below.
I want to talk about two more economies before because we're getting close to the end. I want to talk about the economy of Judas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The economy of Judas.
Yeah, the Judas economy. Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that there's a pretty high probability that all of Jesus's followers were Galileans, with the probable exception of Judas. How do I know that? Well, we see the early recruitment in Galilee. Mm-hmm. In addition, after Judas is dropped from the group, the angels address men of Galilee, after Jesus' ascension.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a Galilean movement. The issue with Judas is that Judas Iscariot, Ish is Hebrew for man, Cariot is the name of a Judean town. And his father is Simon Ishcariot. So, this is not like we know it 100%, but the linguistic indication is that this is the only Judean disciple, and he's the one who betrays Jesus. And I think I'm looking at this from a literary point of view. Look at Judas's role. He centralized the poor pot, right? Yep. The poor purse, right? In the name of giving it to the poor. He ideologically promoted the idea of giving to the poor, right, but he was stealing from the pot. And that is a perfect microcosm of what had happened to the temple. If you read the Torah, the poor tithe stayed in the local community. Every third year, there's a poor tithe to the local community, and it's administered by the elders of the gates. But there had been a legal revolution, like all these Pharisaical workarounds. The lawyers figured out a way. And so the tithe, they always do, the tithe gets collected in the temple and becomes a tax enforced by force. Yeah. Rather than a voluntary giving. And what are they doing? They're stealing from it. They're wetting their beak. So I think Judas, I don't think it's a mistake that we're given these details. Judas is like in one man, a recapitulation, a microcosm of the economic system centered on the temple.
Yeah, it's stuff like that. This is why you need to get this book.
That's really helpful.
But adds so much to the cleansing of the temple. You touch on this in the book, but Jesus going in there and saying, "You've made this a den of thieves," with that historical background where they're sucking the poor dry. Right. Particularly, somewhere in there you note that he's turning over the tables where they're selling doves. Which is the poor man's sacrifice, particularly sacrifice for the poorest people in the nation. Right. There's so much there. Do we have time for one more?
Jerry, you got time for one more?
Yeah, it's a regressive tax. The crooked money changer system, government monopoly, fixed prices. It's a tax, which is unjust. Right. But it's also a regressive tax, which is unjust. So if someone wants to tell me there's nothing economic going on here, then I want you to tell me why in all of the gospel accounts the dove merchants are singled out. Yeah. The only important distinction between dove merchants and other animal merchants is the economic status of the people who use them.
Wow.
Let's do one more.
Okay. All right. So what do you mean by the economics of the crucifixion? Isn't that a bit crass?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not good at determining what's crass. I'm working on what's true.
Yes.
And then crass or not, that's in God's providence. I can definitely tell you that I get a pushback when I talk about this, that it feels impious to people. Right. Even a good friend of mine, I started to tell him about this, and he said, "Well, Jesus was killed because he's the Lamb of God, slain from the foundation of the world." And I said, "Oh, so a spear didn't kill him?"
Yeah.
"Oh, yeah, a spear killed him." But
I see.
But wasn't he killed because he's the Lamb of divine purpose and human agency are not in conflict with one another?
That's right.
Amen. Yeah.
So there's clearly an economic thing going on. Now, my case only holds if you hold to the traditional date of the crucifixion. So if you believe in a 31 AD crucifixion, this won't work. I hold to the traditional date, which is 33. They were in the midst of a empire-wide financial collapse, very much like we saw in 2008. And that deprived Pilate of his political cover because the equestrian order that he was part of was associated with the financial elites. He had been appointed by Sejanus. That was his sponsor, who was also associated with the banking and financial elites. So they were out of favor. No one wanted to hear from anyone who worked for Goldman Sachs in 2008.
Yeah.
So this is it's like 2008, and all of Pilate's buddies work for Goldman Sachs or Bank of America, whatever. So we have a really unusual situation. Pilate, who in his entire time in Judea had always been a hard case, always ready to send soldiers in and kill the mob, gave in to the mob.
Right.
And I'm suggesting he gave in to the mob because of the economic circumstances that created general anxiety. Pilate, he always wanted an excuse to kill Jews. But in this case, he only kills one to assuage another, and releases a violent revolutionary anti-Roman agitator.
Right.
Something weird's going on.
Yeah.
And we don't have any argument that, well, the Holy Spirit came and hardened his heart like Pharaoh.
Yeah.
We don't have any argument about divine intervention. I think this is being done through proximate economic circumstances.
Wow.
Wow.
The other one that I'll just leave you with, so you got to go get the book.
Yeah, you do.
But when he walks through the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, it's going to blow your mind because there's way more going on than you ever thought.
Yep.
It's really that good. Go out and get it. The Maker versus the Takers. Jerry Bowyer, thanks for joining us on Cross Politic.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
More cross politic coming up next. I gotta process all that. We just had a nerd moment here. at Cross
I got a
Politic,
question I'm asking when we get
That
off.
was
here.
Greek and Hebrew.
I know.
And economics.
And history.
All in the same segment.